Afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started in just about 2 minutes. Thanks for joining us. All right, so it looks like it's just about 1 o'clock. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Marcia Lacco with the Environmental Assistance and Customer Service Division within North Carolina's Department of Environmental Quality. I think we had a few new folks join us from Monday, so welcome. Angela, if you'll advance to the next slide. Today's training as part of the 4 modules is being presented by the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, which staff within our section of what we call DEECS manages. And thanks to the Waste Reduction Partners and Land of Sky, they're assisting us with the GoToWebinar platform. So thank you to them for their assistance. Next slide. Okay, and this is just going over, hopefully everyone remembers from last week, webinar housekeeping. So you can hide your panel by hitting that big red arrow. I know some of you had some computer issue or audio issues at the beginning of last week's session. So hopefully by logging out and logging back in, that was fixed. But if those continue, you can always log back in by clicking that phone option, and the webinar code and the phone number will appear for you. I just wanted to highlight that we do have those new handouts. So you have today's slides in the handout section. We left up the design guidance workbook, which helps you implement your EMS. We have a life cycle analysis example, and that actually comes from EPA. And we have 2 exercise sheets, one related to environmental aspects that we're going to do today, and one related to risks and opportunities. So you can access those via that handouts. And last week's recording is not quite ready, but when they are, you will be getting those via email. Angela, next slide. And then the other thing we mentioned last week, we're very laid back. So preferred is to use the question box, but if you have a long question or just be easier to chat with us live, you can raise your hand, which you can see your hand should be next to your name under the attendees menu over there, and then click on that and we'll recognize you and unmute you, because just to start out, everybody is muted. All right, next slide, Angela. Okay, so just a quick overview of what we're going to discuss today. We're going to be talking about risks and opportunities, which is clause 611. We're going to be speaking about how you develop and identify your environmental aspects and what the new standard requires in life cycle perspective. Dawn Burke is going to be discussing compliance obligations and planning actions, and then we're going to end today with some objectives and SMART goals related to planning to achieve your goals. All right, next slide. And then I just wanted to ask if anybody had any questions from last week. So we discussed organizational context. Remember, that's your internal and external issues that are relevant to your organization, including how your organization affects the environment and how your organization is affected by the environment. We discussed those interested parties, who might be interested in your EMS. From doing that review, you then determine which interested parties, their interests become compliance obligations. And remember, that was your legal and other. We discussed how you develop your scope, which is what is included under your EMS, what's required when you develop your EMS policy. And then lastly, we discussed leadership commitment and their requirements to make sure that the organization's EMS is successful. All right, so I don't see any questions coming in the question box. And I don't see any. Don, did you see anybody's hands raised?
No, I see no questions or hand raises.
All right, so with that, Angela, I think you're free to roll into today's materials.
Sounds good. Thanks, Marcia. So as Marcia mentioned, my name's Angela Barger. I actually manage the Environmental Stewardship Initiative along with the rest of the team here. And we're going to go through some of the new concepts with risks and opportunities and some old foes for those of you who've been doing it before with aspects and the horrible language around aspects. I prefer to think of it as environmental impacts. It's easier for people to grasp. And some other things that are related to that, because if you're familiar with environmental management systems at all, once you've defined what your impacts are, it kind of makes everything else in the system dependent upon those. So we're going to start with this planning process. All right, so I believe last time Marcia mentioned that the standard, the way they've written it now, can be kind of repetitive, and they'll say things in different places, and basically you have to do them once, even though there might be multiple shalls that are related to them. So we'll go through these right quick. Organization shall establish, implement, and maintain processes needed to achieve your outcomes. So that's basically saying, that you're going to write your system or implement your system in a way that actually meets what you want to do, right? So it's pretty generic statement for them to even require you to have a shall associated with it. Then when you're planning your EMS, you have to take into account or consider all of the things that we talked about last time. So you have to make sure that you're taking that context into account. Otherwise, why did you determine what the context was? You have to consider your compliance obligations. So that's all those legal and other things. Dawn's going to talk more about those later today. And then you have to, of course, be within the scope of your EMS, right? So all of those things you've already defined by the time you get to this point. So they're saying you went through the process of figuring out what those are, use them. Then when you're planning to use the EMS, the organization shall determine risks and opportunities related to your aspects, your compliance obligations, and any other issues and requirements that were identified in the context and compliance obligations section that need to be addressed. So that needs to be addressed is kind of new. And then all of this risks and opportunities, you have to think broader than just your aspects and impacts. So if you've already done aspects and impacts, and we're going to get into this for those of you who are completely new to it, it's looking at, if you have an environmental impact, what else is associated with that environmental impact that may or may not be environmental. So, but you're needing to address those things in order to give assurance that your EMS achieves its intended outcomes, prevents, reduces undesired effects, and achieves your continual improvement. So we're going to dive into this a little bit more. I think we mentioned last time that the annex of the standard, so if you're going to be implementing a system, we highly recommend that you get an actual version of the standard, and in that you'll find the annex, and it gives a lot of really good explanation into the thought processes, what they're really trying to get at when they use some of these weird terms. In this case, we're talking about risks and opportunities. And for them, they define risks as potential threats and opportunities as potential benefits. So those are your opportunities. right? And so some examples of that I pulled directly from the annex you can see below, and it really makes sense. So an environmental spillage, that's an environmental issue, right? But the reason why is due to literacy or language barriers among workers who can't understand your local work procedure. So that's the risk there. The risk is that you have an environmental issue caused by something that's not necessarily an environmental issue on its own. Another one would be increased flooding due to climate change that could affect your organization, right? So the risk is that increased flooding, which is an environmental thing, but it's due to climate change, which you on your own don't have a whole lot of control over, though us as a large entity might have more control over. And you can kind of see some other examples there. So risks and opportunities, just think broader than just those aspects and impacts. I know on first look, reading through the standard, it sounds like you could just go with your aspects and impacts and be done, but you want to think about other issues that could occur. Not every risk and opportunity is required to be included. You have to have some connection to an environmental management issue. So, for example, you might have hazardous waste disposal risks, and those have an obvious connection to your EMS. But credit card fraud, which is definitely a business risk, doesn't really have any touch to the environment. So it doesn't really doesn't need to be in your EMS. It might need to be considered for insurance purposes or other issues within your overall management, but not your environmental management. And then like life cycle analysis or life cycle perspective, you don't necessarily need to do a formal risk assessment for this particular piece of the standard, but you do have to document those that you are going to do something about. So it's intended to be subjective. It needs to be, it is assumed that it's going to be based on opinions, interpretations, and judgment within your organization. It doesn't have to be an objective determination, so that's why you don't have to do that formal analysis. But your processes must be established in order to ensure that your risks and opportunities are identified and addressed so that your organization can give that assurance that your EMS is achieving its intended outcomes, right? Some other examples of risks and opportunities. So some compliance violations, the risks there would be legal action, fines, having a marred reputation. Some of the opportunities that might be available to you if you go beyond what you're required to do by your permits. You might have an improved reputation. You might get some positive press out of it, which helps your marketing. So you can kind of see it's broader, but it has that environmental touch to it. So here are some examples of where folks have put their risks and opportunities. And Marcia showed you a few of these last time when she was showing you, I can't remember exactly what it was she was talking about. Maybe it was the interested parties, or may have been part of context. But so this is
part of context.
Oh, okay. All right. There you go. So this is one, it's an example from our zoo, and you can kind of see that they have this column here. So you've got your aspects and impacts, and then over here you've got a column for the risks and opportunities that are associated with those aspects. So you can see this impact here is soil and surface water contamination potential, and some of the risks and opportunities here, they have the opportunity for efficient driving, and they have a risk of old vehicles with poor mileage and spills because it's related to spills from their transportation as the aspect, right? The fuel and natural resources there. Another example from them is they have an opportunity for automated irrigation with variable speed pumps when they're talking about their irrigation and watering systems. Another example is this pestle list that she showed you before, where the pestle is their risks and are their impacts or part of their aspect impact list. And then they have the risks and opportunities over here in this column that are related to that. So in this case, you've got chemical usage and chemical storage releases. The risk there is a significant hazards associated with chemical use, but there's an opportunity for them to purchase less hazardous chemicals and test response plans. So you can kind of see how there are opportunities for a broader look. All right. So moving on within the standard, you've got the organization shall determine potential emergency situations. This is one of those, it's really interesting in the new version of the standard, that whole overlap thing. This one is actually split. So you've got emergency preparedness and response, which is going to be in 8.2. So we'll talk about that either next time or in the fourth lesson. I can't remember which one it is, but it tells you to actually define those potential emergencies here, which is just weird, but there you have it. So we'll hit it here and then we'll come back to it and talk more in depth about emergency preparedness later. So basically here it's saying define what your potential emergencies are, including those that have an environmental impact. So we're not limiting it to just environmental impacts anymore. In the older standard, it kind of focused just on environmental impacts, but here we're talking about any emergency situation. And then you're going to look deeper at it and see what the potential environmental issues could be that come out of it in addition. So if you've already got emergency response plans for everything, refer to it. You don't have to create, a whole new wheel just to meet this. But the organization shall maintain documented information on the risks and opportunities that need to be addressed and the processes needed in 611, which is this, and 614, which we'll talk about in a minute, in order to have confidence that they're carried out as planned. So you actually have to write down those risks and opportunities that you are going to do something about. All right. So now we're going to move on to aspects. Everybody's wonderful joy. So here, the standard is saying the organization shall determine environmental aspects and their associated impacts considering a life cycle perspective. So I mentioned before, I like to think of these as environmental impacts. It's easier for folks that are new to the standard to kind of wrap their head around what an environmental impact is. So the impact is what happens to the environment, right? The aspect is what causes that impact. So it's a weird word, I understand that. But basically think about it as cause and effect. The effect is the impact, the cause is the aspect. And the new thing to the standard is considering the life cycle perspective. So once again, you don't have to do a full life cycle analysis, but you do need to look at the entire breadth from getting the materials out of the ground to the end of life of your product or service, right? And we'll talk through some of those. So when you're determining your aspects, organization shall take into account any changes, planned or new developments, new or modified activities, products, or services. So anything that changes within your facility, you need to make sure you're taking into account when you're defining what your environmental impacts could be. You need to look at abnormal conditions, not just those things that happen on a regular basis, but startups, shutdowns, emergency situations, things like that. Anything that falls, that happens, that you know happens, but doesn't happen on a regular routine basis. And then, of course, reasonably foreseeable emergency situations. So reasonably foreseeable is the key here. We talked a lot to our membership about how, in the past, you might not have had pandemic included in your emergency preparedness and response, but after this year, you probably should, because before it might not have been reasonably foreseeable to you, but now that it has happened, it should be. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about life cycle. Some of the typical stages of life cycle include design, raw material acquisition, production, transportation and delivery, use, end of life treatment, and disposal. And you may not be able to control or have influence over all of these particular stages. For example, if you're a production facility, you may not have any control at all over the design phase, especially if it's done by a customer. But these are just some of the stages, and you can pick and choose. You can see like the little diagram has different names and more stages. So whatever works for you within your facility, that's what you can use as your stages of the life cycle. Just make sure you're thinking about it from cradle to grave, right? That's the whole point, is to look at the entire system overall. So let's think about some considerations when you're trying to figure out what aspects you may need to be creating from this entire life cycle. So in the design phase, you might think, what raw materials are you going to need? Are they coming from renewable resources? Can you make them come from renewable resources in some way? Can you reduce the need for hazardous materials in the production? Can you use recycled content materials? So what raw materials are needing? Maybe where are they coming from? If you're trying to reduce greenhouse gas from transportation, maybe you're looking at distance. So anything that you can do during the design phase to reduce the impacts of the creation of your product. Maybe the manufacturing process. Is it additive or subtractive? Are you using 3D printing where there's little waste of extra material, or are you using some sort of punching process or cutting process where you're removing excess material and then you have to actually recycle that material or landfill it or do some other function to it? If you're using a subtractive process, have you optimized it in order to remove the absolute minimum, reducing that material consumption and the amount of material that actually has to have another process happen to it, whether that's recycling or something else? Can you lower the energy needs during the manufacturing process? You know, maybe you can reformulate coating so that it can cure at a lower temperature. Anything along those lines that you can do that reduces the demand on the environment during the manufacturing process, you look at under this design considerations piece. Another one would be easing the end of life treatment. So can materials that are different types be easily separated? So part of our division works with the entire recycling industry in North Carolina, and one of the things that they really have a hard time with are when you have two different materials that are combined in a way that you can't take them apart, which makes it impossible to actually recycle the materials. Whereas if they weren't stuck together in some permanent fashion or semi-permanent fashion, they could actually recycle the two pieces separately. So think about things like that when you're designing. Can the product be reused in whole or in part by another process? We have a member that uses dies to punch out a particular part, and that die over time wears. And so they're making different size parts, but it's all basically the same thing. They just get smaller and smaller. And so as the die wears out, they take that die and they will machine off enough to bring it down to the next size down. So they're reusing that die over and over again until they get to their smallest part, and then they finally will recycle it because it's a big piece of metal, so it's eminently recyclable. But instead of just making new ones all the time, they're reconditioning the ones that they have, which is a really cool thing. And you notice that that wasn't even their product themselves. That was a piece of the equipment that they are working on to reduce its impact. And then thinking about, you know, can you make the product so that it can be recycled easier or composted? An example of that might be a greeting card that has seeds in it. So, you know, you create your greeting cards and then people, instead of throwing them away, can just plant them and have something else. So does anybody have any other examples that they can think of that you might think about when you're looking at aspects during the design piece? I think when we were talking to some of our folks in the wastewater treatment world, theirs, you know, their entire process is environmental, but on the design side, they don't really have a whole lot, except they're designing infrastructure all the time. And so what can they do in their process to make sure their infrastructure lasts longer, is takes less impact in order to maintain it over time. If they're building new buildings, new pump, treatment plants, are they using the most efficient pumps? Are they using lower energy demand buildings? Anything along those lines, where again, their output is clean water, but everything they do on the design side of their infrastructure itself also applies.
Hey, Angela, Ashley chimed in, stated water efficiency.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything on the water, energy, solid waste, anything you can do to eliminate it up front. I mean, that is pollution prevention, and that's, what our grant's all about. So we kind of think about these things a little more than some folks maybe. Any other that you have, Dawn?
Don't see any others right yet.
Okay. So the next phase would be like raw material acquisition. So here are some thoughts on that, and these are not all inclusive. They're just here to kind of give you a spark of what they're talking about when you're thinking about aspects for each one of these phases of the life cycle. So for raw materials, some of the things I thought about were, can you use less toxic materials? That whole greener chemistry. Can you substitute a water-based material instead of a VOC-based material? Those kinds of things. Can you receive items in bulk versus small packages, so to reduce some of that excess packaging waste that has to be dealt with? Maybe it's a type of container that can be refilled versus, sometimes the smaller ones you just have to toss, they won't refill them. But when you get something in a large, sometimes 55-gallon drums or larger, they will actually, you can send them back to the vendor and they can refill them, whether they clean them first and do that, or whether they can just put the exact same thing back in. It just kind of depends on the purity level that you need. Is packaging used on the raw materials returnable or at least recyclable? So, that can come from what you're sending out or what you're getting from your vendors, using that returnable dunnage. We have several members that have worked with their vendors to get things in boxes or crates or other types of material delivery systems that allows them to actually send those back and be reused over and over and over again instead of a bunch of cardboard boxes. Does a material require a higher energy demand than a substitute? So again, this goes back to my example of a coating. One of our members switched over the type of paint they were using because it lowered the amount of energy required. But that same paint actually required less water as well because it wasn't diluted as much, or didn't need to be diluted as much in order to be applied. So look at things where you can reduce both energy and water demand when you're looking at what kind of raw materials that you can use. And we understand that sometimes the raw materials are demanded by customers. They particularly prescribe what you use. But sometimes you can work with even your customers and say, hey, we'd like to try this, and then send it through your approval process and get that switched over. It might take a little bit longer, but if you never mention it to them, they may never think about it on their own.
Hey, Angela, Ashley had a thought. She states to consider travel distance from your vendor or supplier.
Absolutely.
And ask yourself, is there a material supplier or vendor that is closer? Because your goal would be to lower transportation cost, which reduces the footprint.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I mentioned that in the design phase, but it absolutely applies to the raw material. And you'll notice that some of these things are in all of the different stages. Does the usage of your material require additional treatment in the end? In other words, can it go straight out like a water-based material, or does it need some sort of pre-treatment before it can be sent to your wastewater treatment? And then finally, can a material be filtered or treated and reused? We have some folks that are actually filtering hydraulic fluid. We have them that are filtering all kinds of different solvents and then reusing those versus just sending those out as hazardous waste. So any other examples that you would think of?
Not at the time, not at this time.
Okay. So the next piece is production considerations. And for those of you who are in industry, I mean, if you have an EMS already, this is what most aspects and impacts have always looked at. This is the production piece. This is what you do on a daily basis. For those of you who are in more service-related industries, this might not be as intuitive to you. But some of the things you need to think about on the production side is what products do you make? What materials do you use in those products? Think about the types of wastes that come out. So remember inputs and outputs of your production. What kind of contractors do you have? Vendors, suppliers? You know, who's coming on site? Do you have deliveries and servicing that are a part of that? Do you do anything off-site that is within your EMS? Maybe you're servicing something that you're making. Think about where you're located. Are there any specific regulations or environmental issues that you need to particularly consider? Maybe you're in a drought, maybe you're in a place that can have a lot of storms, like the eastern coast of North Carolina. We get lots of hurricanes over there, whereas our west can get more snow-related stuff. And so how they manage their outputs can be associated with other issues. What permits and regulations do you have? You know, definitely looking at what comes out of your process are things that you look at for your aspects and impacts. What fuels or other energy sources do you use? Can you use something that is less impactful? So maybe you're burning coal and you can switch it down to natural gas or some other, you know, even go as far as renewables. It just kind of depends on where you are located and what's available to you and how your system operates. What about water that you use in your process? Can you reduce the amount of water that's running through your system? So how often do you change out tanks, and do you need to change them out as often as you do? Can you use, you know, a chemical that has less water demand? Those kinds of things. And then what about wastewater? That's usually associated with that kind of thing. Okay, anybody, oops. Anybody have any questions or thoughts on production?
Board looks clear.
All right. The next thing is transportation and delivery. And again, you know, we talk about thinking about what's closer to you as far as the types of things that you're purchasing and delivering. So you're going to look at your products and your raw materials and your waste. So everything that's going into your system and everything that's coming out of your system. You might want to think about the air emissions, including greenhouse gases. So again, that goes to the transportation piece, but it can also be those combustion sources and other things that contribute to GHGs. Think about hazardous waste spills. So those could be caused during traffic accidents, or those could be caused inside of a plant or just outside of a plant due to forklift issues or poor storage. All kinds of things within the transportation and delivery world can contribute to hazardous waste spilling places it shouldn't. Fluid leaks, you know, we had a facility that they rented their trucks that they used for delivery, and then they had a contractor that they rented them from come in and do the maintenance in their off hours. So basically they worked 1 or 2 shifts, and then on third shift, the vendor would come in and do any maintenance on those trucks. Well, nobody would be at the facility at the time other than the vendor. So if they happen to have an oil leak or a hydraulic line break or something like that, there was no one there to react to it. So one of the things that we were discussing with them is you need to have something, make sure you have an oil spill kit out there where they can actually get to it. Make sure you have numbers posted where they can get hold of somebody to let you know that it happened, and make sure that they are aware of any way to actually mitigate that and stop it from getting any further out than the immediate area where it happens. In this particular case, they were actually doing this on a gravel parking lot. It wasn't even a paved parking lot, so it like immediately would go into the ground. It's harder to clean up because you have to dig it up. So think about things like that when you're talking about your transportation and delivery piece. The end result was they stopped having them do maintenance on site. They started having them take the trucks back to the owners of the trucks themselves, and they did it on site at their site, not at the member. Parts damage due to shifting, so the better you pack them for quality reasons also helps you with the environmental, because you're not having to remake them, right? And then there's fork trucks, thinking about the emissions from those, because a lot of those are either gas, natural gas, or even, diesel or gasoline. So there are emissions that can come from fork trucks. They're not all electric, but even if they are electric, then you can look back further. What kind of electricity is being provided to you? What are they burning or using in order to provide you with that electricity? And then of course that damage from forks running into barrels or whatever. Okay, anybody got anything on transportation delivery?
Looks like we're clear.
All right.
Yeah, Angela, I was just going to chime in. I don't know if you remember, one of our wastewater facilities chimed in when they were taking this overview class and had an aha moment where they said, you know what, all the piping and our collection system between our customers and our wastewater treatment plants, that would be considered our transportation.
Absolutely.
Or our wastewater treatment plant. So they were at the time transferring in their engineers and designers. So that was one way for them to figure out that, oh, hey, that's how it rolls into our EMS, because some of their staff were wondering how it really touched their jobs. So.
Right, exactly. Although they also had transportation through their trucks that would go out and actually like maintain the lines and stuff like that. But yeah, their actual product was transported to their customers through those pipes. So, all right. Okay. So the next thing to think about as far as steps within a life cycle are use considerations. So thinking about how is your product used in the end, and are there impacts from that? So, what kind of energy is used? Looking at maybe redesigning your system so that it's an Energy Star rated, so that it's using less energy. Same with water, can you reduce the amount of water needed within your product, whether that is water during the process or water that's needed to dilute it or whatever, whether you need to do some rinsing operation with your product. Waste materials that come out of it, maybe you've got a tree or something that's attached to like a plastic piece that isn't necessary. So what kind of waste materials are coming from your product? And of course, the packaging. Is there a way to reduce that packaging and at a minimum try and make it more recyclable? All right, anybody else think anything on use?
Angela, can you define tree? Sorry to interrupt.
So those little, I don't even know how to describe them. Everybody knows what they are. They just don't necessarily call them trees. So it's like the runoff pieces of plastic. Like if you have 4 or 5 small items, they might all be attached together by this extra piece of plastic that's just there to keep them from, separating. during the production process. Sometimes they're there for that, but usually if they're shipped to you, it's just to keep them together. Did that help, Scott?
Yes, thank you. I think of it like when you're making a waffle and the stuff that drips out over the sides.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you can still eat it, but not on the waffle.
And Angela,
Yep.
we have Ashley again.
Yep.
She's mentioned related to recycling, but
Mm-hmm.
finding an end user for those
Mm-hmm.
hard to recycle items, such as extra
Mm-hmm.
pieces of plastic, tabs, scraps, etc.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely looking for that reuse piece before going to the recycling. Yeah, there
She
are a lot
also,
more re's.
yeah, she also added the waffle analogy is very helpful.
Thank you.
So, mhm.
That's why we keep Scott around.
Anytime I can tie food into my discussion, it's a win-win.
And then the last step that I'm going to talk about is end of life treatment and disposal. So can the design of your product be changed in any way to make recycling easier? We kind of talked about that at the beginning when we talked about the design phase, reducing those composite materials, making sure that, there's some function that makes it easier to deal with in the end. Make sure it's not toxic to get rid of, those kinds of things. Do you have a take-back program? A lot of the electronics producers these days actually are required to take back their products and then make sure they get recycled appropriately. But others have take back programs as well. And then does the product inherently break down into some compostable, recyclable, reusable pieces in some way? So think about, what it's going to take when your product is done. What kinds of hoops is your customer going to have to go through in order to make sure that it is properly situated in its last life? Okay. Anything else on that one?
We had one comment from Elizabeth. Let's talk about our audio issues.
Are we having audio issues again?
Let's see. At the beginning of the last bullet, looks like she's got it back, but I'm not sure. Elizabeth, let us know if you don't have the audio back.
Okay.
And then meanwhile, Ashley, let's see. Ashley's added the recycling industry usually prepare scrap items that are separated and not mixed with other waste. Adding a process that separates those scrap pieces can add to the value if you're able to get a rebate or reimbursed for that recycled waste.
Yeah, absolutely. There's recent years, there's been a big push to go single stream, but that reduces the value of the stream because somebody else has to come in and then separate it all back out. So if you're looking for larger rebates, once the pandemic is done and we actually can go back to some semblance of regular life, markets will hopefully come back some for the recycling, and you'll still get a higher value for those items that are separated out. So you've got to figure out, is it worth your time to make sure that it's separated to get that higher rebate, or is it better for you to make sure you get a higher volume recycled by making sure it all goes in one place and getting it to the proper location versus making sure everybody's, putting it in very different areas. It's just one of those things. It's a balance. All right. So I'm going to show you an example. I think if I can get out of here. There we go. Whoops. I can get all my things open in the right places. I had to shut down and come back in just before we. So this, can you guys see this? The life cycle of the soccer ball?
I can.
Okay, good.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is an example. It used to be on the EPA website. Marcia rescued some of these before they disappeared or got archived somewhere. But this is one of the handouts that's attached there in the control panel for you. And so, you know, this is just one way of looking at it, and this is a nice one for you to kind of download and look at, just to kind of get your mind wrapped around life cycle. But you can see with this example of a soccer ball, you've got to gathering the materials of the soccer ball, then you prepare them, you put the pieces together, then you have to get the soccer ball to you, so that's the transportation piece. Then you use the ball, and then you get rid of the ball, right? So basically that is the steps that they decided to go through for this particular life cycle example. And this prints out in like 11 by 17 or something, and then there are these fun facts and things. I think this was originally meant for kids to use in school or something, so you know, but it's neat with the little facts on the back. But it's an example for you to use if you're trying to explain it to someone else what you're trying to come up with, and get them to wrap their minds around what they mean. But just again, to reiterate, you know, the standard is not looking for you to do a full life cycle analysis. They just want you to think about, from beginning to end of your particular process and material, what your impacts, what your aspects and impacts are, right? They don't want you to just focus on that production piece anymore. They want you to look at all of it, anything that you can have any form of control or influence over. All right. So that's life cycle. Any questions? Any more comments on life cycle?
I'm not seeing any.
Okay. So let's move on. So we talked about life cycle. So now let's continue looking at this particular element. So the organization shall determine those aspects that can have a significant environmental impact by using established criteria. So those of you who've been in the EMS world for a while, the change here is this established criteria requirement. So now you actually have to define how you're going to rank your significant aspects. The organization shall communicate its significant aspects among various levels and functions of the organization. So you have to actually make sure that everyone within your organization knows what your significant aspects are. And we're going to do a little bit more with significant in a minute. And then the organization shall maintain documented information. So you have to make sure you keep your lists of all of your aspects and impacts, what criteria you used in order to determine the significant aspects, and then what those specific significant aspects are, right? So when we talk about significant aspects, we're talking about basically some way of ranking them. So you're going to prioritize that list of your environmental impacts and their causes. So you're ranking the causes such that you know what is the highest priority for your organization. So some examples of that criteria. I have several here, and they range. It's whatever works best for you, but it's important to have a defined ranking scheme to make sure that it's repeatable, right? So what some folks do is they say, okay, we're going to get a group together, and here are the aspects that we've defined. You tell us, based on each of these categories, whether it's high, medium, or low. The established criteria piece is these descriptions of what it means as far as being high, medium, and low, because if you have these defined, then it's easier for someone else to come along after you that had nothing at all to do with ranking them in the first place and come up with a fairly close resemblance of what you came up with, right? They might be off maybe one number here and there, but overall they should come up with basically the same order that you came up with, right? So you can pick, you know, any number of categories. Usually 3 is the lowest because you want to make sure that you actually are getting enough in there to have some separation between your different aspects. 5 is typical, but you can have as many or as few as makes sense for your particular organization. So this is just one example with the high, medium, low, and you can see the categories that were in this are like the scale, and that's talking about locational, severity, likelihood, so how often might it happen, duration, is it going to be a long-term or short-term thing, frequency, potential regulatory or legal exposure, and then concerns of interested parties. So that's just one example. Here's another one that uses the low, medium, high, but it also has a none. So if there's no impact at all, they can completely, zero out that particular category. So you can see for severity, there's a no impact. For frequency, there's none, it never happens. For quantity, none, because it never happens, right? So you have that option here. And this was an example from our zoo, so that's the reason not zoo animals. All right. Here's another one. This one is interesting. They use a 0 to 5 scale, but you'll see here under regulated that it's either 0 or 5. So they have a yes or a no. So you can mix your scales for each one of your categories that you choose to use. And notice it's no longer in a matrix format. This one is just in words. So you could just put this into your procedure. So it doesn't all have to look exactly the same. You do what makes sense for your organization. All right. So, any questions at all on aspects, impacts, risks and opportunities? And we'll do a little exercise later after Dawn talks, and we can just pull everything together.
Okay, I don't see any questions at this time.
All right, well then, Dawn, I'm turning it over to you.
Okay, I'm going to redock some of these panels so I can see my computer screen.
And I'll send you, there you go.
Okay. And try to get it to presenter. There we go.
Yeah,
can you see that okay?
We can.
Great. And let me move this panel down here. Okay. Let me, sorry about that. Okay, hello everybody. I'm Don Burke, as mentioned, as Marcia and Angela mentioned earlier with ESI. And today I'd like to take you through a journey on the ISO 14001 standards compliance obligations found in 613. Now we do have a couple of examples later on in the PowerPoint, and I'd love to hear your input on that when we get to that. But for now, feel free to add any comments, questions you have along the way. But let's jump on in. So with 613, the standard states that the organization shall determine and have access to the compliance obligations related to its environmental aspects, something Angela just went over. The organization shall determine how these compliance obligations apply to the organization. Organization shall take these compliance obligations into account when establishing, implementing, maintaining, and continually improving its EMS. This is fluid. It's not a static process, as you can see. And something you'll see all during these presentations, the organization shall maintain documented information of its compliance obligations. And I have an example for that for you as well later on. Now, something to keep in mind, the standard will note, and you can find some of this information in your, if you have the standard, in your guidance documents in the back. But an organization should have a process in place to anticipate and prepare for new or changed requirements. Again, this is fluid, so that appropriate action can be taken to maintain your compliance. It should also consider how applicable legal requirements and other requirements to which the organization subscribes might apply to or affect new or modified activities, products, and services. Now, something else we'll touch base on in a little bit. Remember, there are several sources that can be used to identify and maintain up-to-date information about applicable legal requirements and other requirements to which the organization subscribes. Such sources include all levels of government, industry associations, or trade groups, commercial databases or subscription services, publications, and professional advisors and services. It goes on, and we'll touch base on this in more detail in a bit. So compliance obligations include legal environmental requirements that an organization has to comply with and other environmental requirements to which an organization chooses to comply. Now, compliance obligations can arise from applicable laws and regulation or voluntary commitments stemming from the needs of interested parties. And as a reminder, interested parties is defined as a person or organization that can affect, be affected by, or perceive itself to be affected by a decision or activity. Now, I'd like to go over real quick 4.2 in the standard, because I'm going to refer to it here in just a moment. And 4.2, context of the organization, understanding the needs and expectations of interested parties. It states the organization shall determine which of these needs and expectations become its compliance obligations. So with that, let me jump back up to 613, where it states the organization determines at a sufficiently detailed level the compliance obligations it identified in 4.2 that are applicable to its environmental aspects and how they apply to the organization. Compliance obligations include legal requirements that an organization has to comply with and other requirements that the organization has to or chooses to comply with. You've heard me say that during the last one. Mandatory legal requirements related to an organization's environmental aspects can include, if applicable, requirements from governmental entities or other relevant authorities, international, national, and local laws and regulations, requirements specified in permits, licenses, or other forms of authorization, orders, rules, or guidance from regulatory agencies, and judgments of courts or administrative tribunals. And all through this presentation, we'll touch base on some of these once again, just to reinforce what we're saying here. So legal requirements can encompass a broad range of topics and can originate from many regulatory agencies, federal, state, local, even international. Some examples are, as you can see here, if you're not familiar with all the acronyms, you have the Clean Air Amendment Act, the Clean Water Act, your Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendment, Hazardous Materials Transportation Act, your Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, Toxics Release Inventory Program, your Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, your National Historic Preservation Act, National Environmental Policy Act, a State Environmental Policy Act, Endangered Species Act, and your Spill Prevention Control and Countermeasures Plan. And of course, there's many, many more that may or may not be applicable to your business. Also, examples include permit requirements or limits and reporting requirements, executive orders, the Atomic Energy Act or Energy Policy Act. What local restrictions are there? Pre-treatment permits, grading permits, Superfund or other cleanup agreements, operator or laboratory certification requirements. That one hits home with me because in the 90s, I was involved as an operator in water and wastewater. I worked in a analytical chemistry wet lab, and wow, the certifications required now to do either one of those jobs has changed tremendously over the last 30 years. It's truly amazing. Again, this is fluid. Nothing about this is static. And the key word in this for 14,001 is continual improvement. That's another reason why it is so fluid and for the good. So additional legal requirements, well, include your transformers. In this case, your Toxic Substances Control Act of 76, that regulates the introduction of new or already existing chemicals, by the way. Your PCBs, your polychlorinated biphenyls. Nursing stations and hospitals. I used to inspect a lot of hospitals for the medical waste. And one thing to keep in mind, if you're not familiar with it, there's both bio and hazardous waste that's generated there. Now, North Carolina, our Division of Waste Management solid waste section handles the bio waste, and the hazardous waste section of that same division will handle the hazardous waste streams. A lot of these on every single floor of a hospital, at least in North Carolina. And there's a dedicated room for this. Compactors are there, appropriate containments for there. So it's really amazing how what goes behind the scene in certain businesses you never thought about. Grounds irrigation. You have any local water restrictions? How about pesticide application? Your heating, ventilation, air condition for certified technicians for refrigerant recovery. Fluorescent lights, how are you going to handle the mercury? Is it under a universal waste program that you utilize? And every time I look at fluorescent lights, I immediately think to LEDs. There have been many questions the past years, are LEDs going to be managed as they are now and forever? Well, nobody knows that answer. There could be new rules and regs on how to maintain LEDs, and we'll talk about how you can stay up to date on those rule changes and regulations in a bit. Computer monitors, your electronic waste. Is there a landfill ban in your state? One key thing is to audit your vendor on this. Is your e-waste, your electronic waste, being disposed of properly? Because if it's not, you can still be held liable for that. There's been quite a few big cases in this state where we've found e-waste disposal that's illegal, and a lot of the facilities that we track back this stuff to due to finding serial numbers and mailing labels, etc., they were shocked to find out that their waste stream had been diverted in an illegal way. And fortunately, those that we could identify helped us recover their materials. But audit your vendors, because otherwise liability can come knocking at your door. Cardboard, are there local landfill bans for that? Additional includes state landfill ban materials such as wood pallets, plastic bottles. It goes on and on. Again, we'll touch base on just how you can stay on top of that. Other compliance obligations, these many examples you see here, from ISO 14001 commitments down to insurance and FEMA, supplier requirements. As you're looking these over, just remember, compliance obligations also include other interested party requirements related to its environmental management system, which the organization has to or chooses to adopt. These can include, if applicable, agreements with community groups or non-governmental organizations, agreements with public authorities or customers, organizational requirements, voluntary principles or codes of practice, voluntary labeling or environmental commitments, obligations arising under contractual agreements with organization, relevant organizational or industry standards. So, right. Now, I mentioned keeping current with changing regulations, very important. I've encountered many sites that they were shocked to know that upon my visit in my regulatory days, the rules and regs had changed. And while they were still doing their job, they're using an old permit or old rules and regs, say from RCRA, and they were unaware of the change. So I would help them navigate on how to keep up to date on this. And one of my philosophies was, well, mentioning RCRA, if you're going to apply for an EPA ID number for your hazardous waste, you should certainly know how and know that you should keep on top of this. No, nobody's going to necessarily come knocking at your door. Sometimes you may get a notification of a rule change, but for the most part, you need to keep your eyes on this. So how would you do this? Well, you can subscribe to an update service or get updates from an industrial trade group, which I mentioned. You can attend meetings or trainings. One of the more popular ones here in North Carolina is NCMA, the North Carolina Manufacturers Alliance. In this case on the slide, you'll see the EEHS, their Environmental, Energy, and Health and Safety Conference. They also hold workshops for air, water, wastewater, and air. And usually the presentations include regulatory updates. Your own state environmental department, such as NCDEQ, North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, which we're part of. EPA webinars. I love EPA.gov. It's a wonderful source for not only past webinars that you have access to, but upcoming webinars. And let's see, check regulatory websites. I just mentioned EPA.gov. Your own state environmental department will have that. We actually have as part of our ESI webpage, upcoming events where you can sign up for. Registration link is there. Join the regulatory listserv. We assist our sites with that as well. Contact, in our case, North Carolina DEECS, Division of Environmental Assistance and Customer Service, which ESI is part of. Contact an environmental assistant coordinator. Hire a consultant if possible, depending on the budget, of course. How about a regional university? We utilize North Carolina State University. We've utilized their industry expansion solutions. It helps in the same city that we're headquartered in, but check a regional university is what they have to offer. Refer to a corporate legal team if you have one in place. And create a tracking or reminder system, such as a compliance calendar, task reminders, etc. We, in fact, were playing around with this through, I believe it was the Microsoft Teams tools yesterday after a meeting, but many of those are available for you. So this is not a requirement of the standard, okay, but it is necessary for our compliance evaluation. It is indeed implied. One of the more important things to help keep you up on this is my time in water quality. Sampling frequencies were one of the most non-compliant issues around. The people in place were doing their job. However, the new permit with new frequencies for their sampling criteria were not given to the actual operators or personnel in charge of this. They were still doing their job, utilizing the old permit, but the new permit was never trickled down to them. So make sure if you see permits now and then, don't assume everything's going to be the same as the last permit. That's where you can, it's your handbook for success. Make sure you can make use of that. Now, here's an example we have of a compliance obligation. It's a photo of a rock quarry. I've got a little background information on it, but I'm gonna hold off on that to see if anybody perhaps might bring it up. But as you're looking at this, you'll see the surrounding. You have subdivisions, you have businesses nearby, you have infrastructure such as roads. Some are paved, some are dirt. Okay, rather large quarry, at least for this state. So ask yourself, who might be interested parties for this rock quarry? What might be their needs and expectations? Okay, we'll start with those two. If anybody has any input, if not, I've got a few insights to it. But who might be interested parties for this rock quarry? I already said some of them when I set up the photo. If anything comes through, just let me know. And
we've got a hand raised here, and I'm gonna try to scroll down and see who that was. I think it might have just been lowered.
That's all right. Well, how about adjacent subdivisions, right? You have people living next to a pretty volatile business, right? Nothing simple or gentle about this operation. And go ahead.
One came in the residential area. That's residential area, local businesses.
You got it. Fantastic. They're all impacted. In some ways that they're impacted. Well, let me tell you one tidbit on this operation. This quarry only blasts during the day, during the daytime when most residents are not home. So they have voluntarily taken this on and has become one of their compliance obligations. So that's great, because one of the next questions is, what compliance obligations might the quarry voluntarily take on as a result of the needs and expectations of these interested parties? So they realize that they're trying to be a good neighbor. So hey, daytime blasting, majority, not all, everybody's at home. Some people work off shifts, some are stay-at-home parents, etc. Businesses, same thing. It could be a disruption with certain businesses, but at least they're trying to keep this to a daytime realm for those people around it. They're trying to be a good neighbor in that aspect. It looks like north on the map, there's there's some land that they may or may not own, but if they do own it, they definitely don't want any issues to come about with the renewal of permits in the future as they expand their mining. This is a prime example of one we have here in the eastern part of the state, down in the town of Aurora. It's phosphate mining, and they take you know, not only do they provide a lot of jobs, but they do their best to take care of the environment. They have wildlife rehabilitation projects on areas that they've moved out of. They relocate roads, the infrastructure. There's subdivisions north and, or I should say west and east of them. There's even a ferry terminal there nearby for not only their employees, but people that come and do other jobs and work in the area. So they actually, when the mining changes directions, guess what? They put in new roads, new redirections. They do a pretty good job. So roads were
infrastructure. Yep.
Yeah, roads. And if the dirt, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Heidi chimed in with local roads. You know, they have to be maintained, dust abatement.
Oh, you got it. I was going there next. If it's a dirt road, you need to suppress the dust carryover. Yeah, excellent. How about, of course,
Hey, Don, someone was had eagle eyes and noticed that there's a Tesla service center. So they were like, you know, because you were noting the blasting was during the day, maybe they'd be an interested party. And the person noted Elon Musk, but I don't think you've mentioned this yet. Someone was asking, is anyone in the area using well water?
Exactly. One of mine was going to be water quality issues. Exactly. Some of these examples we'll bring up will actually have a lake nearby or a river, but this one, yeah. What about your underground aquifers? Exactly. Wonderful. So there's water, there's air, you know, with the dust suppression, noise, you know, and they're trying to limit that to the daytime at least. Let's see. Again, they're in many aspects, they're trying to be a good neighbor. They're going above and beyond their compliance obligations. And some of these, again, they've taken on voluntarily. Okay.
Sorry. I was just going to give you some insight on this particular quarry. The big empty space up here above, the picture that you see actually belongs to the quarry, and they are expanding north.
Yeah.
So that paved road that's just above the quarry currently, they actually had to move that road. So that was something they took on as well, was as part of their compliance obligations to minimize the impact on those neighborhoods and businesses, was moving that road. So
these are all real life examples, and that one goes hand in hand with the example I was talking about, the one in east of where I'm at in Aurora. They've done the exact same thing, but they also, before they use that property, they had to renew their permit. I believe it was a 40-year renewal, and prove that it could be maintained in a proper way. So it was about a 5-year process for that to push through, but they've been good stewards of the area. They have open transparency. I'm not sure if this one does, where they'll actually, when applicable and safe, will give tours of the place and show, especially when the mining moves elsewhere, the land that's left behind, they'll immediately try to do a wildlife rehab and restore that area. And they'll give public tours on that on buses. So transparency with communication is huge. Now, here's one note on this. Compliance obligations from voluntary commitments can indeed change. By taking on this voluntary commitment, an organization is not bound to it until the end of time. Again, this is fluid. It's not static. Things change. It's reevaluated every year, every permit cycle, and hopefully there's good give and take through the communication process with all of the interested parties. So, okay.
Don, Heidi had another, she's on this one, she's on this activity. She brought up that it's not, while it's not environmental exactly, it can be, but nighttime security to prevent folks who shouldn't be on site get injured, or they could cause mischief with environmental related things like tanks, etc., equipment.
Yeah. The first thing just in my mind is chances are they're going to get hurt. But is the mine still liable for it? Yeah, probably. But yeah, then you have, you know, people like to play on tanks or empty excavators and things like that. So you're right.
So that goes to those risks and opportunities that we were talking about as well, that, you know, there's an environmental impact there that could be related to that safety issue. So.
Yep. All right. Any others you see? Okay, if there are, I'll back up. Now, here's an example of a tracking tool I mentioned earlier. You see your, and you can, it's not cookie cutter, everybody's different. You can take something like this and format it for your needs. But first column, you see compliance obligation title. In this case, it's a stormwater permit. So what's the regulatory agency driver? Well, in this case, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality, DEMLR. It's our Division of Energy, Mineral, and Land Resources. Where can you find the citation and link? Well, 40 CFR 122.26. You'll see a general description of the compliance obligation. In this case, it's your stormwater outfall discharge monitoring, stormwater pollution prevention plan, maintaining your stormwater BMPs, your best management practices. Again, a general description. What's your applicability trigger? Well, permit required if the facility is has a SIC, a standard industrial classification. If it has a point source discharge, if it stores or processes materials outside, which would be exposed, of course, to the stormwater. Environmental aspects, which Angela's mentioned before, is your stormwater runoff. So what's your summary of controls, such as SOPs, plans, permits? Well, in this case, they have the NPDES Industrial Stormwater Permit, an SOP of visual inspections, an SOP of how to sample waste stormwater. You may have a turnover in staff or somebody not able to do it on the sampling day. So, and non-stormwater discharge certification. The location of guidance documents and resources. This is a big one for me. But SOPs and guidance documents are located in the main office. Fantastic. Now, in the main office, is it in a filing cabinet? Which one? Is it locked? Is there a key that more than one person knows? I've seen many situations, both with EPA dual inspections with our state, with just a solo inspection where they know where the documents are, or they don't. I actually had to show them where the documents were from my previous 2 or 3 visits there, and it was a replacement, a staff who had replaced the manager there because they were gone for that day. It was an unannounced inspection. So that was pretty painful because I had other people part of the inspection team, and we had difference of philosophy on should I help or not. So, but I was helping them find these. But one of the big ones was showed up and most of their staff were gone. This was with our hazardous waste section. Most of the staff in charge of the documents were gone at a hazardous waste compliance workshop. So that's why they weren't there. How ironic is that? They knew where the documents were, but one of the people that were gone, they were the only ones with the key. So, you know, sometimes that'll just cause, in this case, a return visit. But I thought it was very ironic. They were attending a workplace a few counties over when the regulatory section showed up for that same workshop. Monitoring requirements. Is it qualitative monitoring? They have non-discharge discharge certification, and of course the sampling. And I've mentioned this before in this presentation, date due and frequency of reporting. This can change. Qualitative monitoring, which in this case is twice a year. They have non-stormwater discharge certification, which is once a year. Sampling is twice a year unless above benchmarks, then once a month. These things can change. So hopefully you're notified of a change, but it doesn't always work that way. So make sure if you get a new permit, in this case, you read it with the fine-tune comb and compare it to the old permit. And make sure the people that are doing the sampling are notified of this. And then finally, documents and records required to be maintained. Well, they keep their qualitative monitoring records, stormwater discharge search, stormwater pollution prevention plan, copies of sampling results, calibration and maintenance records for 5 years, and make sure we can prove the calibration and maintenance of these. I think we'll be talking about this, I think it's me, next week or the week after. But maintain those for 5 years at least. If you're not sure, just ask. Ask your regulatory agency that's looking over you. And then submit sampling results within 30 days, not 31 or 32, but within 30. If there's going to be a delay, reach out. Maybe that agency can work with you, but reach out on that. I've known some organizations, they didn't even know that they had a due date for that. And they did the sampling, but suddenly it was a month over NOV was generated, and they were unaware that that even existed. And it just so happened again, staff was substituting for staff. They weren't up to date on that. So I believe that's it. So unless anybody else has any questions or comments. Okay. Now, Angela, if I'm not mistaken, are you doing planning?
I am.
Okay.
But the next thing we're going to do is an exercise. Thank you.
Risk and opportunities, right?
Yeah. So we'll do like we did last time. I'll go through what we're looking for on the exercise, and then we'll take like 15 minutes and you can do exercise and a break together. So work on, you know, the exercise and then take your bio break or grab a snack or a drink or whatever you need to do, stretch, since we're getting about halfway there. So let me share my screen again so you can see what we're going to do. All right. Can you see my screen now?
I can.
Okay. So in the handout section of the control panel, I think Marcia mentioned there is a risks and opportunities exercise document. So you'll want to open that, and you'll also want to open the aspects exercise form. So what you see up on my screen at the moment, this is what the risks and opportunities exercise looks like. This is what the form looks like. So one is in Word, the other is in Excel. All right. So what we want you to do is just think about your process, and your process can be, you know, making a widget, or your process can be creating educational materials. It can be whatever you actually do in your particular organization, right? Because we know we have folks from EPA, we know we have folks who are making, you know, gaskets, and we have folks doing all kinds of things out there on this. So, you know, we're going to have service providers, we're going to have widget makers. So think about it from your perspective and go through each of the life cycle stages of your product, whatever that is. And if, you know, you're even going through an expansion process, think about buildings and those kinds of things that you're doing. But go through this and come up with an environmental impact for each one of those life cycle stages that you have some control or influence over. So you can kind of see we've got it written out what we're looking for here. If you don't have any control or influence, just put NA, not applicable, in that space, right? Once you're done with that, then take those impacts and figure out what the aspects are that are associated. So remember, impact is the whatever is going to happen to the environment. The aspect is what caused that particular impact. And you can have multiple causes to the same impact, and you can have multiple impacts for the same cause. So think about, you know, what that is, and then fill in this one. And then for, you know, those aspects and impacts that you defined above, then think about any risks or opportunities that happen to be associated with those. Now, you can do this all on these sheets, or you can open up this spreadsheet and go ahead and start putting it in here. The spreadsheet is just an example that we give out to folks. It's within our design guidance. So you put your aspect in here, what life cycle, you put an X or a C or an NC is the way this one's written, and you can see up here what those mean. Under each one of the life cycle stages that aspect applies to, you can type in here what areas or departments you have within your organization, what is the impact from that aspect, your ranking. So after you've figured out your aspects and impacts, right, then you're going to want to look at the ranking. Remember, we talked about all the different potential ranking things, and I'll show you a good list to work off of in a second. And then you can choose to either add those across, multiply those, do some sort of weighting. You know, if something means more to you, like for example, we have some folks that say if it's a legal obligation, it's significant no matter what. So maybe you're going to put that somehow in your ranking system. So you're going to do your total over here, however you've chosen to do the math to get to the total. Some folks actually use controls to reduce that number. So if you've got it adequately controlled, then you could put some subtraction factor or division factor there, and then decide whether or not it's going to be significant based on your ranking criteria. So once you've chosen to put things in a certain order, where are you actually going to choose to say, okay, these ones are significant versus the ones that are below that? Are you going to look for your top 10? Are you going to look for a certain numerical value? Are you going to look for a large break in your numbers? So let's say you've got numbers that range from 10 to 32. And it just so happens that between the number 27 and 22, you have this break, whereas all the other ones seem to be grouped pretty closely between 1 and 2 digits. So maybe that break is where you say, okay, anything above this number is significant, and anything below this number is insignificant. Not necessarily insignificant, that's a bad choice of words. It's still an aspect. You still want to work towards it. So remember, the whole point of the EMS is to reduce your impact, right? You're trying to have continual improvement. So if you never have a way to lower the significance of your aspects, then you're not really making progress. So those folks that choose to make anything that's regulatory significant kind of handicap themselves in moving forward in reducing the impact of those aspects. Then there's a spot for you to put in those risks and opportunities that you defined on that exercise, and then if you had any comments. So we have multiple members within our program that actually use this form or a modified version of this form. So you're welcome to use it if it seems helpful for you. But for right now, we just want you to go through this exercise. Now, the thing that might be helpful for you, oops, wrong one, is to open up the design guidance that's also in one of the handouts. And if you scroll down until you get to step 3, it looks like it's the meat of it is starting on page 36 of this document. You'll see here are some examples of aspect categories. So these would be those causes, right? And then here are some examples of impact categories that you could potentially look for. So when you're going through and thinking about each one of those life cycle stages, you can come and look at this table and say, okay, do any of these kind of apply to me? Now, these lists are not all inclusive, but it at least will get your mind moving in those areas. And then if you keep scrolling down, here are some options for you for examples of criteria and ranking. Now, you don't have to use a 5-point scale. You can say 1, 3, and 5, and just make sure that, you know, anything that was included in 2 and 4 makes sense in one of the other categories, or you can rewrite these descriptions however you need to. But again, here are just some examples of criteria that you can use on your ranking. And again, this is all in our design guidance as well as that form, so feel free to use them. You don't have to use every one of these criteria. Pick a few. It helps to have, again, more than 3, but you don't want to go overboard either, because at some point you start overlapping what things mean. So pick the ones that make the most sense for your organization. All right, anybody have any more questions on this exercise and pulling all of this together?
Angela, I actually had one that I missed before we moved from you to Dawn. So now is actually a good time to ask it.
Okay.
This is from Chad Burnham. Can you briefly describe any issues that may take place if your scoring criteria is too limited or the scale is not wide enough to show adequate differentiation?
Yeah.
I actually
That's
have an
funny
example of that.
I was gonna say that's funny because that's kind of what I was just talking about. Hi, Chad, by the way. Good to hear from you. So if you don't have enough criteria, or if your numbers come out too close, you might want to think about either adding a criteria or changing how you are ranking, by either making that 1 through 5 or making it so that it's like a 2-step between, to get that separation so that you can actually see a difference between your what you're going to define as significant and the other aspects that you have. Scott, you said you had a good example you could give.
I do, and actually it's not specific to aspects and impacts, but I was in another life working for an industry and trying to bid out for a third-party waste hauling company, processing company. And I used a scoring matrix, and I used odd numbers only, and then there was a category where I weighted things, and I did give out zeros as well. So, you know, that spread, if you're kind of using a tight range, 1 through 3, then potentially at the end you come up with everything is significant, right?
Right.
Or in the case of if you're trying to bid out for something, then everybody wins and you got to hire all 10 companies or all 5 companies.
Mm-hmm.
So the wider your spread, you can really, it really differentiates between, you know, that winning bid or that most significant thing versus the thing that may not need as much attention.
Right, exactly.
I
But
was just gonna,
I was
hey,
gonna say,
Anna,
having too few also can be a problem, because are you making sure that you're looking at all of the things that are important to you in defining what is significant environmentally? So if you're only looking at 3 topics, that can also potentially cause the same issue where, you know, everything is kind of muddied together. And when you do the gut check of looking at this list, the thing that you expected to be the highest is really down near the bottom, and that shouldn't happen, you know. You kind of know on a gut level what the highest environmental impact thing at your facility is. Now, it might not be the number 1 thing, it might be number 2 or number 3 when you do this analysis, but it shouldn't be down in the 20s or 30s, right? So you might need additional categories to make sure that the things that are the most important are rising to the top. Now, Marcia, what were you going to say?
gotta unmute myself. Sorry. I was just gonna say, sometimes we've seen folks that multiply things together get better spreads,
Mm-hmm.
or some of those other things you mentioned, like subtracting out certain things if you've controlled them.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little easier if you can work it into your mathematical calculation somehow to really amplify the differences between your criteria.
Right, right. So any other questions either on the exercise or anything that Dawn and I covered before we take a quick break?
I'm not seeing any right now, but sometimes they come in a little delayed. So we'll give people a chance to think about that.
Okay, well, it's 2:30 here on the East Coast. So let's say 15 minutes to work on the exercise, take your break, do whatever you need to do. We'll come back here at 2:45 Eastern time. We'll talk to you again then. I'm going to take a quick break myself, but then I'll get back on. So if somebody has a question before the end of the time, that's fine. I'll be here in a couple minutes. So, all right, we'll see you guys in about 15 minutes. And if you have any questions, go ahead and pop them into the box, and we'll look at those in a minute. All right, talk to you in a minute. Bye. Welcome back, everybody. It's 2:45, so hopefully everybody had a chance to get up and stretch for a second. I know sitting here for several hours can be painful. But let's take a minute and just kind of walk through this exercise, and hopefully this will trigger any more additional questions on risks and opportunities and aspects and impacts for you guys who are, particularly those of you who are new to this, because this really is the meat that everything else in this sandwich is built around. So did anyone come up with any design impacts that they see within their operations? Anything in the chat box?
Well, yeah, Heidi, we had a couple of comments. Heidi had
Oh, okay.
for a possible scoring system.
Mm-hmm.
I'll have to scroll down here to get all of it. But on a scale of 1 to 10, answer the following questions. Number 1, what is the significance of the impact? 2, what is the historical probability or frequency of the cause of the impact? 3, what is, my scroller, there it is. What is the potential severity of the impact? 4, how can the impact be contained? And the scores for each question to rank the aspect's significance. Well, actually, and there's a correction. She's got multiple or multiply the scores for each question to rank the aspect.
So if you were using this form, let's, just as an example, you don't have to use this form. You can do this any way that makes sense for you, okay? But if you were to happen to use this form, what she's saying is for each one of those different categories that she mentioned, right? Then you would have the numeric system, what was it, 1 to 3, 1 to 5? Dawn, I don't remember what you said.
The first one on 1 to 10, but she does have a follow-up. She does have a follow-up as well, but go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So like on a 1 to 10 scale, you would take and look at each one of those categories, ask those questions, give it a numerical value, multiply it across, and then that would be the total, right? And then you would order each one of these highest to lowest to figure out your significance. All right. So
Okay.
good example, Heidi.
Yeah, and she goes on to say like question 1 goes from 1 for not regulated to 10 for regulated, which would be non-compliant. Question 2 goes from 1 for only once every 5+ years to 10 for continuous.
Mm-hmm.
Question 3 considers personnel, none to multiple deaths. Environmental, right. That would be none to widespread permanent damage. And public, none to plant closure. Impacts and takes the highest score across the 3. She had a question 4 that goes from 1 for full containment to 10 for uncontrolled. So it goes on. So something that is regulated, non-compliant, occurs continuously, results in multiple deaths and causes the plant to close, would have a score of 10 times 10 times 10 times 10, which would be 1,000. Right. So yes. It would be significant. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. It's definitely a scale that's usable. It's all about, making sure that each one of those numbers are defined so that someone can repeat it, come up with a very similar number to what you ended up with, basically the same, order of ranking. And then you want to make sure that you have enough categories established to make sure that you are covering those items that are the most significant to your organization, and that you're not picking categories that don't really apply to you. So, we've had some folks that just kind of, they're taking someone else's example and using their categories to define a different system by, and they don't really make sense to them. So, when we look at it and they're like, yeah, this just really isn't our highest impact to us, we're like, well, have you looked at the categories that you're using to rank, and do they really apply to you? And they're like, well, no, we don't really have this community input piece that they have here, but it's the one they had, so we just used it. And I'm like, well, think about switching that out for something that does apply to you. So that's the reason we have all of these examples and say, pick the ones that make the most sense for your organization. All right. So did we get anybody who had any design impacts?
That's about all I see.
Okay. So we talked about the different things that could happen during the design. Really, design impacts, you see them further down, like into the production pieces of it or the acquisition pieces of it. But if you don't look at it during the design, it's hard to change otherwise. What about acquisition of materials? Did anybody have any impacts from that?
Looks clear.
Oh. All right. So nobody has to worry about getting materials from another country at this point that might have slowed operations due to COVID. No one needs to worry about hard to source materials.
Angela, we
Heidi,
had one. Oh,
yeah,
go ahead.
Scott. I was going to say, Heidi chimed back in. Conflict minerals regulations.
Yep. Yeah, that can be an issue. Absolutely. Okay, how about production? Somebody has an impact from production, absolutely. Anybody use energy? Anybody use water? What kind of fuels do you use to heat?
Eric has given us a comment. As a laboratory, we have to have a Department of Agriculture permit for soil samples from fire ant zones. Fire ant zones. We're very familiar with those. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So in that laboratory, you're saying your impact are the chemicals from the fire ant. So the impact of those chemicals on the environment if they were to be released. All right. Anybody else have a production example?
No.
All right. Remember when we're talking about aspects, you can go back up here and kind of look at these categories and the impacts. When you're thinking about impacts, think about the effect that you're having on the environment. So is it water pollution or air pollution? Are you creating a metal resource depletion or natural resource depletion? Some positive impacts, remember, the environmental impacts can be both positive and negative. So some of the positive things, you might be conserving landfill space by reusing something. You might be helping with water resource conservation by reducing the amount of water that you use, maybe using something that doesn't have that water demand on it. So think about these kinds of things when we're talking through this. What about transportation delivery? Any impacts from those? Even if you're just working at a site, you have transportation and delivery, you commute every day, right? Maybe not right now, but on a regular basis. You drive into your place or you take the train, or some folks may even need to fly from one location to another. So what kind of transportation delivery of yourself, even if all you are is a service provider and not a widget maker?
Okay. Heidi has stated fuel usage, going
Absolutely.
to LPG vehicles or hybrid or electric vehicles or equipment.
Right. Yeah, that's a good one. I know our EPA site out in RTP also has a lot of van pools that they run. So they're actually still using gas-powered vehicles. However, they're making it more of a mass transit, that is specific to that site. If you're in a bigger city, it's easier on the mass transit side. Here in North Carolina, we're a little bit more spread out. So mass transit's a little bit harder to come by when you're outside of the larger cities.
And now it's masked transit.
Thank you for the dad joke, Scott. All right, how about use? Anybody come up with any impacts of use? Remember, impacts can be positive. So if what you do is an educational function, perhaps the use of your particular product is the edification of the person who is using it, right? So maybe they are taking the information that you're providing them and teaching others or changing their behavior in a positive way. Okay. End of life treatment. Anybody have something that would require end of life treatment?
We do have, this one just popped in from Heidi again, thank you. It's reclassifying materials as they expire. E.g. a glue used on planes expires, but still glues, let's see, use it, I guess can still use it for non-plane applications. Use it all up rather than declaring the glue as a hazardous waste after it expires for its intended, I believe, purposes. And that's excellent. Yeah.
Perfect.
Extended
Yeah, I
life.
actually had an example similar to that the other day. One of our members emailed me saying that they had a bunch of sodium hydroxide that was about to expire from their system, but was still perfectly good. It was new in the barrel. And while they can use some of it in their wastewater treatment, you know, pH balancing, they wanted to give the opportunity for other members to be able to actually use that chemical instead of, you know, trying to get rid of it as hazardous materials or whatever, without it ever actually getting used. So it may have expired out of that person's or that company's use life, but it might not have expired out of somebody else's use life.
Okay. We actually have 3 more comments.
Oh, good.
Andrea, the plant where I'll be working is on the outside of the city. So many employees will arrive with our own vehicle or by means of company transportation. How could the amount of CO2 emitted on air pollution be measured? And is this related with transportation for the EMS?
It could absolutely be. If you're looking at your greenhouse gas emissions as a whole for your company, and you're using some of the tools that are out there, EPA has some tools on their website where you can estimate those numbers. It all kind of depends on, you know, the miles traveled, the type of car it is, its efficiency ratings. So you'd have to actually go and use some of those tools that are out there. So just do a Google search and you can find some of those. I don't have any off the top of my head.
Elizabeth has a comment. She said the education example is a good one for me. Just this morning, some students got experiential learning and what can happen when they don't read all the directions. She says it's a good lesson for the future.
Yep.
Yep.
I think we've all had that. You know, where some funny teacher will give a test and say, make sure you read it all before you start answering the questions, and then the last question is, if you read it all, you don't have to answer the questions. So. That's good.
I'm sorry for the pronunciation. It's either Jana or Jana, but our company offers customers the opportunity to send us old equipment to be refurbished and returned or credited to account, and we then refurbish it and resell.
Perfect. That's awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Those take back programs are great.
Yep. And Julia,
so that's great for end of life. Sorry,
I
was trying to get it back into this.
Yeah, Julia is talking about end of life as well. End of life treatment. When purchasing printers, Find out if the company has a take-back program, a la. Otherwise, the products can be donated to schools or nonprofits, sold via GSA platform, or recycled properly if non-functioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm not even sure if we actually own the printers in our building, or they may just be on a long-term contract or something. But there's also rental ways to do that too. So the company continues to own them, and then they can refurbish and resell them at the end of the life for the company that's renting them.
And I do have one more. Let's see, from Heidi. After the work from home experience from COVID, continuing telecommuting when things return to normal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, impact from commuting. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think a lot of
absolutely.
people are reevaluating that now. Yes.
Yeah, I know our management is talking about not necessarily everybody getting to stay home, but more of us being able to telework more frequently. So yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of managers have come to believe that telework is a good thing.
Yeah.
Angela, I did put into the chat there and sent out to everybody a good Scope 3 inventory guidance from EPA.
Thank you. Awesome. Yeah, I knew there were some on EPA's website. I just didn't have them at my fingertips, so thank you.
All right, Scott, now you have to define what Scope 3 means.
So when you're doing a greenhouse gas inventory, an official one, you have to define different scopes of emissions. So scope 1 are GHGs that are produced at your facility. Scope 2 would be things that are related to things that you do. So for example, using electricity, the GHGs that are created at the plant that is creating that electricity. So your use of the electricity causes that plant to create the GHGs. Scope 3 is usually like commuter and other.
I've got the textbook definition here if you want that.
Ooh, even better, because I was just trying to remember. It's been so long.
From the EPA website, Scope 3 emissions are the result of activities from assets not owned or controlled by the reporting organization, but that the organization indirectly impacts in its value chain.
Okay. Awesome. All right. And then anybody have any final disposal? I think we've had some great examples, end of life and other. All right. So moving on to the aspects and impacts identification. So did anyone come up with the aspects that were associated with those impacts? We kind of talked a little bit through those as we went. So remember, the impact is what happened to the environment, and the aspect is what caused that to happen.
We do have a comment from Angela. www.epa.gov/warm. It's helpful tools for calculating your greenhouse gas emissions.
Good, great. Yeah, I've heard of the warm tool. Thank you. Have not dug into it much, but I know it's out there. All right, so you figured out what your impacts are. You know what caused them or could potentially cause them, right? What risks and opportunities did you come up with? Did anybody associate risks and opportunities outside of those aspects and impacts? Things like that legal issues happening because it was a regulatory problem. If, for example, you had a hazardous waste spill, perhaps you could get a notice of violation, which is a risk, or perhaps there were the risk of having employees get hurt because they couldn't read the work instructions that were associated with that particular aspect or impact. Opportunities for improving education, improving your marketing related to something being improved. All right. And then if you went through this and actually used the ranking, you know, then you could see what it looks like when you start putting things in order. So hopefully this has been helpful for you, you know, to just kind of get an idea of what it would look like if you don't already have a system. If you do have a system, go find what it is that you're using and see if it makes sense to you now that you know a little bit more of what aspects and impacts mean. All right. Any more questions before I move on?
Helps if I unmute myself. One just
Yeah.
popped in, or a statement from Heidi. Many times folks don't prepare for emergencies that they have no control over, such as flood, tornado, that could cause issues for their facility.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk a lot about emergency preparedness and response when we get to that section. Like I said, in this section, it does, you know, tell you to define what they are. Later, it tells you to manage them, and we'll talk about them more when we get to the management section of those. But yes, absolutely, those should be looked at when you're doing risks and opportunities and aspects and impacts as well. And I have some fun examples, some actual examples of that too. So we'll talk about that, Lynn. Okay, anything else?
Looks like that's it for now.
All right. All right, so continuing on, this kind of ends up that whole planning section with aspects and impacts and risks and opportunities and compliance obligations. Basically, it says the organization has to take actions to address your significant aspects. So if you've defined it as significant, then you have to do something about it, right? If you have compliance obligations, you have to do something about those. So whether that's, you know, making sure that you're submitting your reports on time, putting control devices on, whatever it is that compliance obligation requires you to do, you have to take action to address it. And those risks and opportunities that you identified. So if you said that it was risks and opportunities enough that you had to write it down and keep it as documented information, then you in this standard are now required to do something about that risk or opportunity. So if it's related to an aspect, then you're already working on it through your operational control, and we'll talk about that later. You also have to plan how you're going to integrate and implement the actions into your EMS or other business processes. So how are you actually going to go about making sure that the actions you put in place are managed and appropriately and implemented? And then evaluate the effectiveness of those actions. And when the organization shall consider when you're planning the actions, technological options. So you can think about, is technology improving to a point that you can use a different method? So maybe you have a paper system and you can now switch it over into a cloud-based system or something like that. You can also take into consideration financial, operational, and business requirements. So maybe there is technology out there that could improve your operations. However, the costs are currently way too high. However, you now know about them. And so as things come down in price, then perhaps you could implement that piece of technology, right? Okay. Moving on to environmental objectives. So I'm going to give you one last chance. Anything we've talked about to this point, aspects, impacts, risks, and opportunities, compliance obligations. I think that's all of it. Okay, let's move on to objectives. This one's a little easier. Everybody sets goals, right? Some folks, I don't know a whole lot of folks that have this year, but a lot of folks set a goal at the beginning of the year, a resolution, and then immediately break it. Well, the management system would help you to not break that, right? Because it's all about putting systems in place for you to make sure you're continually improving and working towards those goals. So the ISO 14001 standard now has taken out the weird and confusing language of objectives and targets, and now it's just called environmental objectives. So the organization shall establish environmental objectives at relevant functions and levels that take into account the significant aspects that we just defined, right? Any associated compliance obligations that Dawn talked about, and consider your risks and opportunities. So when you're developing your objectives, you need to think about all of these three things. The objectives shall be consistent with your policy, measurable if practicable. Okay, so here's my soapbox. The word practicable is not the same as the word practical. If it's practical, it means you do it, if it's easy to do, if it's convenient. Practicable means you do it if it is at all possible. So it's convenience versus necessity, right? So it needs to be measurable. If you can make it measurable in any way, you need to make it measurable. That's what the standard says. All right. It needs to be monitored, communicated, and updated as appropriate. So when you're setting your goals, you need to make sure that it's all of these things. And then the organization shall maintain documented information on your objectives. So you need to be tracking those objectives in some meaningful way that is documented and someone else can come back behind you and see it. All right. So one of the ways that you can do that, and this is not required by the standard, but it is something that we have found good practice, and so we're going to talk through it, is set your goals up in a way that is known as a SMART goal. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and time-bound. And so you can set SMART goals for anything. The first time I heard about SMART goals was setting up the review. We call them VIPs. It's our performance reviews, right? So they wanted us to set SMART goals within our performance review. So these can be associated with anything, right? So let's go through SMART. In order to be specific, you should set your goal up to ask these things, right? So what are you going to achieve? What do you what do I want to achieve, and why do I want to achieve it? It helps if I read my slide. Where is it going to happen? Is it going to be at a specific location within your organization? Is it a specific line? Or is it going to be corporate wide? How are you actually going to achieve that goal? When is it going to be due? When are you going to actually start the actions, and when are you setting an end date for it? And then identify any requirements or restraints that might be implied. In order for it to be measurable, can you identify when you reach your goal? So when I say something has to be measured, it doesn't mean that you necessarily have to set a 5% reduction goal. You can set a goal to complete a study, right? How do you know when you've reached your goal? Well, you've completed the study. So you can measure your progress towards that goal by saying, we've completed this many steps of the process to get to that goal. So being measurable doesn't necessarily mean it has to have a reduction involved, but it should have some way for you to measure your progress over time. Right? So you can think about it as milestones or something like that. And do you have concrete evidence that you have made progress towards your goal? Do you have access to the parameters of measurement? So when someone is actually doing a measurable goal, do they know what numbers they have to fall between for it to be a positive impact? Or if they go outside of it, do they know what they need to do to react to it to bring it back in line? have baselines been established? You know, maybe that's the first step of your goal, is to set a baseline if you don't have one already, so that you know where you're starting in your goal. You know, if you have a reduction of 5%, you have to know what you're comparing it to. So what baseline are you using? What units of measure are you going to use? And make sure that you're consistent about those units of measure over time if it's a long-term goal. And then, are you going to normalize that data? Normalizing typically is compared to either income or production time or number of widgets. You know, it's some way for you to see progress over time for those things that have a running baseline amount that's above 0. So, for example, if you're working in a building, there are some amount of lights that are on for security or safety reasons all of the time, right? So if nobody's in our building, we still have lights on. So there is still energy being used, you know, that vampire energy of, you know, computers being plugged in even if they're not on, exit lights, things like that. So there's always going to be energy going through, right? So, but you might have production that's going up and down and up and down. So depending on what you're doing, you might normalize it to your production data to kind of zero out that baseline level of energy that's already being used. So hopefully that makes sense if you haven't ever heard normalization before. Other things to think about on measurable is where are your metrics going to be located. You know, human resources typically holds training records. Purchasing may hold your cost of contractors or the contracts themselves, any costs of raw materials. Maintenance typically has your prevention and repairs of things. So both corrections and preventive maintenance types of records. Your accounting might have your actual costs, your invoices, utility bills. You know, we have a lot of folks that set energy and water goals and then struggle to get the data because it's stuck somewhere in accounting because they have all the invoices. Your compliance officer might have all of your permits, and so they're the ones who have access to those parameters that need to be met if you're looking at a goal that is specific to a regulatory issue. And then production has scrap rates, right? So you might use any of those or all of those when you're setting your goals. So just make sure you know where your data is going to be located and make sure that you have access to it. Okay.
Angela, I just had a thought on measurable. I think the pandemic has kind of pulled back the curtain too of, you know, all your analog meters or digital ones that aren't hooked to the cloud. Who and how are you going to get that data back? Mm-hmm. And even in adverse weather.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. All right, the next letter in SMART is attainable. That's the A. So to make it attainable, you want to set goals that are realistic, but also challenging in order to strike a balance between aiming too high or making goals that are too easy, because both of those can cause a lack of interest and involvement in the process. However, having stretch goals that take time to accomplish can be a good thing. So you might just, when you're talking about them to other levels of your organization, talk about them in a different way. So for example, zero waste to landfill. So we have a lot of our members who over the past few years have set this goal to become zero waste to landfill, and however they define that, you know, whether that's like a 95%, whether it's just reductions within their production side and not the entire building, we don't care. We help them get wherever they want to be, however they define it. But, you know, they might set the zero waste to landfill goal and be at 2% when they first start. And so that can seem very overwhelming. So sometimes what they'll do is they'll break it down and they'll set their zero waste to landfill goal out 10 years, but they'll say, okay, we're going to reduce the amount of waste that we send to the landfill by 2% year over year, right? And so what they're communicating to their organization might be that they have a 2% waste reduction goal this year, which is much more manageable than a 98% goal. So sometimes it's about the communication piece when you're setting an attainable goal. All right. Is it relevant? So is your goal matching your company's philosophy, mission, statement, and policy? Remember, that's actually one of the requirements of the standard, is that your objectives are within your policy, right? That they fit within that. Does the goal fit into your corporate culture? Is it customer driven or vendor driven? I mean, if it's customer driven, it's absolutely relevant to you because your customer wants it and therefore you're going to do it. We have lots of members that have customers that are starting to push down, particularly on packaging. Some of them are pushing down on the amount of reusable material, recycled material percentages. We have a new member in our program that works with lots of the fast food industry, and they make napkins, right? So they actually have requirements for the amount of post-consumer paper that has to be in those napkins that they are producing for that customer. So it can absolutely cause you to have different goals. All right, does it improve your efficiency or save money or time? Does it improve your relationship with the community? You know, think about those risks and opportunities piece. Those also will talk to your relevance. And then the final, within SMART is time bound. So to make it time bound, you definitely want to set deadlines. So we require an annual report of our members. And part of the annual report is that they tell us what their goals are. And one of the biggest things that they don't do, that they should, that we have to go back and ask for more information on. Some of them won't give us, when was it due? You set this goal, but what is your target? What are you aiming at? When do you want to have it done by? And so having a time bound on the end of that helps. So set that deadline. Make sure that your timing is realistic, but also make sure it's flexible. If something happens, you can change your goal. You can change the due date. Just document what you did and why you did it. We'll show you a form that we use in our system. It's actually in that. No, I don't think it's actually in this presentation, but we can get it to you. But we have a form that goes through all the different steps for achieving your goal, and has all of the things broken out. It has who's responsible, when it's due, each one of those steps. But then at the bottom, it's got a place for revisions, and that revision set of lines is not for the form itself. It is for the goal that is being followed up on this piece of paper, right? So you can make changes to your goal. You can make changes to the order of steps that you're doing to get to that goal. You ordered something and it got back ordered, and so that's pushed when that's going to happen, right? So you just change the date and you make a note about why you changed that date. It's okay. And then, do you have a way to follow up if something is missed? So are you having regular meetings about where your goal stands, in order to know that part is backlogged or whatever? All right, so that's SMART, right? So we're going to go through some examples of some different types of goals that are set, and we'll talk through, how they're SMART or not. All right, so within your system, you might set goals to investigate or study things. So an example written in SMART format would be, you're going to study the feasibility of gray water usage with a final report due by the second quarter of 2018. You can see we've been using these slides for a while, so some of these are going to be older. So is it specific? Yes, you're going to do a study of gray water usage. Is it measurable? Yeah, because what's going to be the outcome of that is that final report, right? Is it attainable? Well, we're going to say yes. I mean, it's, we're going to assume that this was done in the time that was given, or it was adjusted to make sure that it was. Was it relevant? Well, if they're using water and are going to do the study, then yes, it would be relevant to that particular organization. And then was it time bound? Yes, it was supposed to be done by the end of the second quarter of 2018, or by second quarter 2018. Right? You might set a goal to control or maintain something. So your objective would be maintain stormwater compliance with 0 violations by the end of the year. We have a lot of members, going back to the zero waste to landfill, whose goal is to maintain that 0 waste to landfill percentage, which can be right now just as hard as achieving it in the first place because of the market fluctuations that are going on. All right, so those are, a couple of potential things to set goals for. You might set goals to develop an EMS. So if you don't already have one in place, then you might set a goal to implement with third-party audit by January 2019. So, you've got the specifics. You're going to implement that EMS. You're going to measure it by having it have a due date that you can say, okay, we are going to get that third-party certification, right? So it's measurable. When you get that third-party certification, you can say we are 100% complete. Is it attainable? Okay, again, it's in the past, so I probably. It might depend on your financial state if you're actually going for third-party certification, and it might depend on the support that you have. But we're gonna say yes. If you're willing to set that goal and track it, then yes. Is it relevant? Well, yeah. I mean, developing an EMS can be relevant to any organization. And then is it time bound? Of course, because we said that we're going to have the audit by a certain day. All right, you can set a goal to improve your EMS. So you already have one. Perhaps you want to make it better. So your objective might be to streamline a contingency plan to make it more user-friendly. So you can, by the year end of 2018. So again, that follows all the SMART rules, and you can do that for like anything. You can, we had a lot of folks doing the improve the EMS types of goals when the standard changed from 2004 to 2015. They had until like September of 2018 to get that completed. So a lot of them were making those changes to their documentation and implementing those changes along the way. And so if they had it as a goal within their system, if they happen to get audited in the meantime to the older standard, they can, show progress towards that. Because that was a pretty big ask for a lot of our members and others who had to make that change. All right, and then you might set goals to improve your environmental performance. And these are the ones that we love as a program that's within the pollution prevention realm. We love to see these kinds of measurable reduction types of goals. It's the ones that people can really wrap their heads around measuring. So for example, you might reduce electricity use by 10% in a specific fiscal year from a specific fiscal year baseline, right? So you've got the piece you're comparing it to, you've got the year that you're actually going to do it in, and then you've got the amount that you're trying to reach, right? So these are all just how you define the goals that you're going to be setting. And then, of course, you might want to improve your environmental performance. So you might want to increase the volume of your recycled materials by 50%, right? And you're going to do that calendar year 2018 from your 2015 baseline. Again, written in SMART goal format, and it's a very measurable type of goal. Okay. So these are some examples that came from some of our annual reports. And for the record, they're not all SMART goals. Very few of them actually are. So let's go through a couple of examples. So is replacing all the lighting in the warehouse by the end of fiscal year 17 smart? Is it specific? Don, Scott, is anybody
Not
popping in?
yet. No,
Okay.
not yet. Oh, here's one. Julia says no.
No. Okay. Yeah, you're
And
correct. It's not specific.
Eric backs her up. No.
Yeah, you're correct. It is not specific. I mean, you can replace the lighting in the warehouse, but what are you replacing it with? What is it? I mean, are you replacing LEDs with incandescents? I mean, that would be silly. So you might want to put a little more definition into this one. So I think what they meant was they were going to be replacing like these high bay sodium lights with fluorescence at the time that this one was written, but
Now, Elizabeth has a funny. Given that 2017 has passed already, it is not attainable.
perfect.
But
Yeah,
also,
absolutely.
yeah, but also she feels like for a one-liner, it's specific. It
Yes.
cannot cover this in one line.
In one, I'm sorry, say that again.
Yeah, I can't cover this in one line. Anyway, yeah,
Okay.
it's
Okay.
specific.
Gotcha. Yeah.
All right.
It's not specific because there's too much that they need to include in order to actually have it be.
Right.
Yeah.
She
Gotcha.
just typed in, it's too complex to explain in one line. Yeah.
I understand. No
Gotcha.
problem.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah. So absolutely, that one's specificity has some work to be done, and I like the attainable. Thank you. How about increased recycling? Is that one smart at all? It might be attainable, but it's certainly not specific. You could measure it.
Julia's got, again, no, not specific.
Yeah. All right. How about pollution prevention? Reduce greenhouse gas generation by 3% indexed to sales. Is that one smart? Is it specific? Measurable?
Let's see. We have Jana. She's got, is my goal of winning the lottery and retiring to a beach smart? You know, a SMART goal.
I don't know. Is it time bound?
Yeah, with a smiley face. Yeah, is it time bound?
Is it time bound? I like it. So the one I read out, I would say is not smart. It's not time bound. The other pieces may or may not fit. You know, is it attainable? Maybe. It kind of depends on what they've already done. Okay. And then how about the last one? Divert 98% of solid waste from going to the landfill annually. You think that one's smart?
Michelle's got, nope.
Why not? I like the discussion on this one.
Yeah.
Why don't you think that this one is smart?
She's got not time bound for me, for one, not time bound for one. So, yeah.
It kind of is though, because they have that annually piece at the end. So they're looking at diverting 98% of their solid waste every year. So basically it's an annual goal that recurs.
Yeah, Elizabeth chimes in, this one has multiple problems. And Michelle follows up with, what is the baseline?
Good. Yeah, it does not have a baseline. It doesn't necessarily need one though. See, you can read into some of these that you probably shouldn't read into it, and that's a whole different thing we'll talk about in internal auditor.
We have a few more comments. Eric's got, well, maybe 90% a year, but in what year?
Okay.
Chad is from where as well.
Yep. Okay.
And Kevin, he states unrealistic. So.
Gotcha. It might be. You know, we have some folks that do it, but how they do it varies. A lot of them use waste to energy, and there are those that do not believe in waste to energy being a valid outlet.
Jana's got, when is this supposed to be attained?
Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Good. I like it. So it sounds like you guys understand the SMART goal piece. Yeah, goals is usually a pretty easy one to follow and grasp.
One more, Michelle states it is realistic. She states, I have a company in Arkansas that consistently operates 98% waste free.
Yeah, we have multiple within our state, within our program, and then even some outside of our program that they deem themselves and or have been certified to be zero waste to landfill. Some of those, we have one company that is 98% waste free or zero waste to landfill, and they refuse to claim it that they're zero waste to landfill because that last 2% they won't send to a waste to energy place because there's no BTU value in it. And so when they say zero waste to landfill, they want to be 100%. Whereas others define it as 95%. Like I said, for us, it doesn't really matter how they define it. We want to help them get as high as they want to go. So.
Heidi's statement, 10 years ago, years ago, TI set the goal of zero waste.
Mm-hmm.
She states, if you don't set the goal, you won't work toward it.
Yeah.
She
So that goes back to that
follows,
attainable discussion.
She follows up, TI has made steady progress. I don't know where they are at this moment, but yeah.
TI, I assume she's talking about Texas Instruments. So
Gotcha.
if that helps. All right, good discussion. All right.
And she says yes, Texas Instrument.
All right. So once you've set your goals, you also have to plan to achieve those goals. So this is also, in the old version of the standard, they called these programs. And in our going around and doing our functionally equivalent analysis, we actually came across a certified system where the folks there never understood what a program was. So this is one of the sections of the standard where I'm kind of glad they gave some more information. Because what a program was in the old version is basically how you're going to reach that goal, right? So these are the steps that you're going to take to make sure that you're achieving those objectives. So what the standard says now is when you're planning how you're going to achieve your objectives, the organization shall determine what you're going to do, what resources are you going to need, who's responsible, when it's going to be completed, and how the results are going to be evaluated, including what you're going to monitor. So does that sound familiar? Now do you understand why we were asking you to do SMART goals? Because it hits all of those things, right? If you write it as a SMART goal, you have hit almost everything that they have just asked you to do in order to set up your plan to achieve that goal. So your organization shall consider how actions to achieve your objectives can be integrated into your business processes. So that integration piece, that's new to the standard. And, sometimes it's a little hard for folks to understand integrating actions into other business processes. But it's kind of interesting for us because as part of the Environmental Stewardship Initiative, our highest level, the steward level, that's one of the things that we've required them to do for years. So it's kind of fun for us to see that it's now actually a requirement of anyone who has an environmental management system, especially certified ones, that they have to have that integration piece. So some of the things you can look at for integration is location. Are you going to, implement these actions organizational wide, or are you going to apply them to a specific department or a specific line? Are you just going to, have some things happen in the office area? Or are you going to do it over the entire building? It might depend on the location of your significant aspects. You might have a goal that only affects a specific aspect within your system, and so it will apply everywhere that significant aspect appears. It might be a site-wide goal in order to increase your involvement or visibility. So a lot of folks that are just getting started with an environmental management system, one of the first goals they set is to, improve their recycling in some way. So whether that's, setting a percentage goal, or whether that's setting a implementation of recycling area goal or something like that, but they do things like that in order to get everyone involved. It may not be the most significant aspect that they have, but it's one that they can do that's very visible and gets the most people involved. Also, you might look at the employees. So how can you integrate it across the various functions? Well, you get as many employees involved early as possible. You might look at specific ones who can be champions for different areas, those that bring up environmental topics here and there anyway. Maybe they have a child in school that gets all excited about recycling, and that's gotten that employee excited about recycling, or maybe one who's concerned about compliance, not compliance, climate change, and so that's getting them excited about climate change. And so, we've seen a lot of that come about that causes champions to occur at all levels of the plant. So helping them to create a sense of ownership will help them with the buy-in part of it. So if they have an idea, sometimes it helps to put them in charge of making sure that that idea comes to fruition, right? And then once they see that the ideas they have are valued, then they start spreading the word to others. Look at this, I got a certificate for doing this. I got a gift card for putting my idea in the system, even though the feedback I got was that, we can't afford to do this right now. Having different little things like that to get your employees involved and engaged. Communicate your expectations. Make sure the employees know what's expected of them, and then show them progress. Those charts and graphs that we see in some of our facilities that show, okay, our goal is to reduce our energy usage, and here's where we started, and this is what we do each month. And seeing that graph go down really can help to show that what they're doing, what they're being asked to do, is making a difference. And then you might consider linking the achievement environmental goals and business goals to some rewards program, like I was talking about. We have folks that do, they require all of their employees to submit so many improvement suggestions over the course of a year, whether that's environmental or safety or whatever. And then they do drawings for, prizes, whether that's like a free lunch in the cafeteria or something like that. We have others that make it part of their review process, where they're required to do so many, and that's just part of their job requirements, where they are reviewed on that annually, and it may impact a raise potential or a bonus potential. And again, it doesn't always have to be connected to money either. Just giving them a certificate of appreciation, or having them, recognized in front of their colleagues at an all hands meeting or something like that. So some other integration examples that we've seen might be having management review meetings more frequently than annually. Having the management actually be out on the floor to have those meetings. We've seen a good many of what we've heard them called our tier meetings, where you've got upper management that meets with the supervisors at a big board, and then the supervisors go to their departments and meet at a slightly smaller board, and then maybe the team leads then take that back to the employees in their specific areas. And those boards have environmental, safety, morale, quality, and they talk about everything, and they do it out in the open where everybody can see it. So that's a really good lean technique that we've seen that has translated over into this integration piece.
Hi, Angela. Eric's got a comment basically comparing it to trickle down EMS, perhaps.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that can be. Also integrating your environmental goals with other business goals using like the triple bottom line approach where you're looking at environment, people, and planet. It's people, planet, profit. There we go. Those are the three. So using that is a good way to show integration. The frequency and type of communications that you're having with your employees regarding the progress on your goals, as I mentioned, and any other environmental issues. You can do that through newsletters, through boards, through meetings, all kinds of different ways. Developing departmental goals that are related to environmental issues. So, having them go both ways, whether the goals coming from the top down or from the bottom up, the leadership of those. And then cross-functional management meetings out on the floor, like I discussed. So those are just a few examples of integration. Does anybody else have any good examples? Okay.
Yep.
Anybody have any questions? Because that's it for the day.
Yeah, we've got some, Heidi, as part of Planet, look to other businesses where you can build a waste to feedstock ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, Scott, that's up your alley. Scott's all into the circular economy and trying to help facilitate that in any way that we can. Any other questions? I can't believe you guys actually understand aspects, impacts, risks and opportunities, and all of that so easily, especially as an overview. So we do what we call we have a series of 6 module classes that we can do for our members, and they go into much more depth, and we give a lot more examples and talk a lot more about definitions and things, lots more exercises when we go into it. So when I do this as an overview, I'm always like, did I tell them enough?
We've got a couple comments. Heidi states, I work a lot with EU companies and regulations. The EU goal is a circular economy by 2030.
Wow, awesome.
And Kelly, thank you very much. She's got a comment. This is a good overview and explanation. I've enjoyed today's talk. We've enjoyed having all of you with us.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you guys. We're glad this is beneficial for you. And again, we're recording today's session once our friends at the Waste Reduction Partners have had a chance to download them and then edit off the gaps at the beginning and the end, and potentially our break time in the middle if remind them to do that. We'll get those posted and we'll let you know when that gets posted. All right. Well, if there are no other questions.
No.
All right. Well, we'll give you back an hour of your time then. We hope everybody has enjoyed it, and we'll be back on next Thursday. You got something else, Tom?
Got one question. Eric wants to know, are handouts available after these sessions?
So we will post them with the recordings, but if you didn't get a chance to download them and you need a copy, just shoot one of us an email. My email address is angela.barger@ncdenr.gov. So if you just shoot me an email, we can make sure you get any of the handouts that you didn't get to download either from this week or last week or whatever.
And Andrea would like to ask if we have any questions after this webinar, where can we contact you? So
Same
again,
thing.
Same thing. Yeah.
And Don, if you wanted to contact Don on anything that he went over, or you can contact me and I can get it to him. His is don.burke, B-U-R-K-E, at the same end, ncdenr.gov.
And we also have a a service account that goes to multiple staff, which might be easier to remember, which is
That's true.
ncesi@ncdenr.gov, ncdenr.gov.
It's just ESI at
Oh, it's
ncdenr.gov.
just ESI? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
And if you want just something to click, I put the link to our staff page for our program and
Thank you,
Perfect, Scott.
and that has all of our contact information.
And
Perfect.
Julie has mentioned, perhaps some have not seen it, they can download the documents above. I guess if you didn't get a chance to do that, then afterwards,
Mhm.
yeah, we can work with you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, just let
Since
us
we
know.
are changing them out.
Yeah, we are changing them each week. The design guidance is the same as last week, but we do change out like the slides and any of the exercises.
Right. And
All
then
right.
if you, I was going to say one last thing. If you take a look at that design guidance workbook, it's a PDF. So if you want anything, and most of that is Excel, or we have some stuff in Word, shoot us an email. We're more than willing to share.
Yeah, it's just too big to give you guys in
Yeah.
the Excel format. It's hard to even email, so we PDF'd it. But we can definitely break pieces out of it. All right. Anybody else have anything?
Now we got a bunch of thank yous, and I'm
You're
saying
welcome.
thank you all, and it's our pleasure, and we really appreciate you all attending. We really do.
Mhm. Absolutely. And we will talk to you again next Thursday, 1 o'clock Eastern. And we'll talk about the next set of stuff and get you a little bit further down the line on EMS knowledge. All right.
Got it.
Thank you all. Talk to you next week.
All right.